one waitress, one arrogant millionaire, and a grand piano. What began as a cruel attempt to humiliate her transformed into a moment that silenced the room and shattered egos. You won't believe how she turned the tables, using nothing but her talent. It was a warm Friday evening, and the hum of conversations filled the air at LaFontaine, an upscale restaurant tucked into the heart of Raleigh, North Carolina. The clinking of glasses, the soft footsteps of servers, and the faint strains of jazz emanating from a corner piano created an ambience of refined indulgence. Deborah, a 25-year-old waitress with a quiet demeanor and an unmistakable spark in her eyes, moved swiftly between tables, balancing plates and smiles. To most patrons, she was just another face in uniform, yet inside, she carried dreams much larger than the luxurious dining room around her. Deborah's passion, however, was not in serving tables. It was music. Ever since she was a child, the piano had been her refuge, a place where she could express every joy, every sorrow, and every unspoken thought. But dreams do not pay the bills, and working long shifts at LaFontaine was a necessity, a stepping stone toward the music academy she longed to attend. Few knew about her hidden talent, except for the restaurant staff, who occasionally caught her stealing moments at the old upright piano in the back room during her breaks. That night, as the evening rush began to settle, the door swung open, and in walked Leonard Grayson. Instantly recognizable as the wealthy entrepreneur, Leonard made an entrance as if he owned the room, flanked by a few equally polished companions. Leonard exuded an air of superiority, and he was known for his sharp tongue and penchant for spectacle. His presence made even the most seasoned staff stand a little straighter. Deborah's colleagues exchanged knowing glances. Leonard was not an easy guest. He was the kind who thrived on pushing people's buttons. For Deborah, however, he was just another table to manage in what would become a long night's work. But this evening was far from ordinary. As Leonard scanned the room, his gaze landed on Deborah. Something about her immediately caught his attention. A momentary pause, then a smirk. Deborah felt the weight of his stare but brushed it off, focusing instead on refilling water glasses and clearing plates. Yet Leonard wasn't done with her. He had already decided that she would serve as his entertainment for the night. Deborah had grown up in a small town in South Carolina, where dreams of grandeur often seemed as distant as the stars. Her mother, a single parent and a tireless caregiver, had worked double shifts as a nurse to ensure that Deborah and her siblings always had food on the table, despite their modest means. Music had always been a constant presence in their home. Her mother's old vinyl records and the out-of-tune piano gifted by a neighbor had planted the seeds of Deborah's love for melody. That piano became her escape. While other kids played outside, Deborah spent countless hours teaching herself to play. She mimicked the songs on the radio and then ventured into classical pieces she found in second-hand music books. Her talent did not go unnoticed. She performed at church, at school recitals, and at community events, but recognition could not mask the financial hurdles that loomed over her dreams. By the time she turned 18, the reality was clear. A professional music career would have to wait. Scholarships had not come through, and family responsibilities took precedence. Deborah had to pack away her concert ambitions, replacing them with the practicality of earning a living. Yet she could never fully abandon the piano. It was more than a dream, it was her identity. When she moved to Raleigh a few years ago, Deborah sought out a job at LaFontaine not merely for the pay, but because of the grand piano tucked into the restaurant's corner. Even though she rarely had time to play, simply knowing that it was there gave her comfort. The music had never left her. It was simply waiting. That night, as Leonard and his entourage took their seats, Deborah approached their table while balancing a tray with practiced grace. Leonard ordered a top-shelf scotch and cracked a joke loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Deborah offered a polite smile as she took their orders, her voice steady despite the strange energy radiating from him. "Deborah?" "Uh-huh," Leonard said, glancing at her name tag. "Sounds like someone with a lot of hidden talents." The comment caught her off guard, but she nodded politely and stepped away to place their orders. She did not notice the knowing grin Leonard shared with his companion, nor the way his eyes followed her every move. Leonard was not simply observing, he was planning, and Deborah would soon find herself at the center of a spectacle she had never asked for. The evening carried on like any other, with the hum of laughter and clinking silverware filling the room. Deborah maintained her steady pace as she moved between tables, handling difficult customers as she had many times before. Yet something about Leonard felt different. Not merely rude, but calculated. His presence loomed like a shadow, making her uneasy in a way she could not quite shake. By the time the appetizers were served, Leonard had already begun his performance. However, it was not the kind Deborah expected. He held court at his table, loudly recounting tales of his success and peppering in jabs about those who lacked ambition. His entourage laughed dutifully, while other diners shot annoyed glances his way. Deborah tried to remain focused on her tasks, but as she returned to his table with a bottle of wine, Leonard caught her off guard. "Tell me, Deborah," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, "what do you do when you're not carrying plates? Surely a young woman like you has dreams." His words stopped her mid-step. Deborah hesitated before offering a careful answer. I play piano sometimes," she said softly, hoping to keep her response brief. Leonard's eyes lit up and a sly smile curled across his lips. "A pianist, huh? How fascinating. Why don't you give us a little performance?" For a moment, the entire room seemed to freeze. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Deborah felt the atmosphere change. "Oh, I couldn't," she stammered quickly, forcing a nervous laugh. "I'm just here to work tonight." But Leonard was not about to let it go. "Nonsense," he declared, his voice booming. "There's a piano right there in the corner. Show us what you've got. Surely a future star like you isn't afraid of a little audience." His companions chuckled, clearly enjoying the spectacle, while other diners turned their heads, curious about the commotion. Deborah's chest tightened as she felt the heat of their stares and the silent judgment waiting to unfold. She wanted to say no, to walk away, but Leonard's challenge hung in the air, a dare to either rise to it or crumble under its weight. "I really shouldn't," Deborah stammered, glancing around for support. Even her colleagues seemed hesitant to intervene. Leonard leaned back in his chair, sipping his scotch with a smug smirk. "Ah, I see," he said mockingly. "All talk, no talent. That's disappointing." His words hit her like a slap, and Deborah's hands clenched at her sides. She was not one to seek confrontation, but the way he dismissed her, as if she were nothing more than a joke, a nobody, cut deeply. In that moment, her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Never let anyone make you small, Deborah. You're bigger than they'll ever know." A long silence stretched between them. Deborah glanced at the piano, then back at Leonard. His smug expression seemed to dare her to take the bait. Against her better judgment, she did. "Fine," she said, her voice steady but low. "I'll play." The dining room bristled with anticipation as Deborah walked toward the piano. Each step she took was weighted with both fear and defiance. The entire room appeared to hold its breath as she approached the gleaming grand piano. The soft glow of the chandelier above cast a spotlight on her, isolating her from the murmuring crowd. Her fingers trembled as she slid onto the bench, and the polished keys gleamed like a challenge waiting to be met. Behind her, Leonard leaned back in his chair, the picture of smug satisfaction, as though he had already won the game he was playing. Deborah closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely think. This was not like the church recitals or the cozy community gatherings she once knew. This was different. Hostile. There was no turning back now. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling their cool surface beneath her fingertips, and the first notes were soft and hesitant, almost fragile. A few diners shifted in their seats and someone coughed in the back of the room. Deborah ignored these small disturbances, her focus sharpening as she leaned into the music. She chose a piece she knew by heart, a soulful rendition of Ciela de Lune by Debussy. The melody spilled into the room, weaving through the air like a delicate but unyielding thread. As her confidence grew, the music swelled. Her hands moved with a grace that belied the chaos inside her, the notes pouring out like a confession. Each chord seemed to carry a piece of her story, the sacrifices her mother had made, the long nights practicing in a cramped room, the weight of dreams deferred but never abandoned. Slowly, the diners fell silent. Their earlier chatter was replaced by a collective stillness, and even Leonard, who had been whispering to his companions, went quiet. Deborah did not need to look at him to sense the shift in the room. The mocking energy had dissipated, replaced by something she could not quite name, perhaps awe, perhaps humility. The music soared as Deborah allowed herself to let go, for the first time in what felt like years. In that moment, she was not merely a waitress or a struggling dreamer, she was an artist. Her fingers danced across the keys, drawing out emotions so raw and vivid, they seemed to hang in the air like smoke. By the time she struck the final chord, the room was utterly still. There was a brief moment when no sound could be heard, only the lingering resonance of the piano. Deborah sat frozen, her hand still resting on the keys, uncertain of what would come next. Then, as though released from a spell, the audience erupted into applause. The sound was thunderous, reverberating off the walls and filling the room with a warmth Deborah had never expected. Some diners stood clapping with a fervor that brought tears to her eyes, while her co-workers, who had been watching from the sidelines, joined in with quiet smiles and subtle nods of encouragement. Leonard, however, remained seated. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by an expression Deborah could not quite decipher, part shock, part discomfort. He raised his hands and clapped slowly, a hollow sound compared to the cheers around him. Even his hesitant applause could not overshadow what Deborah had just done. In that moment, she had reclaimed her voice. No amount of condescension, no matter how cutting, could take that away from her. As the applause began to fade, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Deborah slowly stood, her knees still trembling but her back held straight. For the first time that evening, she truly saw the people watching her, not as mere spectators, but as witnesses. Their expressions carried something new: admiration, respect, and even a hint of awe. She did not immediately look at Leonard. Instead, she gave a small, polite nod to the diners who had clapped the loudest, her lips curving into a faint smile. It was not pride she felt, but relief. Relief that she had refused to let fear silence her. Then, as though magnetized, her gaze shifted to Leonard. He was still seated, his hands clasped in front of him on the table. The confident smirk he had worn so brazenly earlier was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his face was a mask of forced neutrality, as if he could not decide whether to admit his misstep or to double down on his arrogance. Finally, Leonard spoke. "I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places," he said, his voice louder than necessary and breaking the fragile silence that had settled over the room. His chuckle, though lacking its usual bravado, landed like a dull thud. His companions exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or remain silent. Deborah tilted her head slightly, studying him. His words were meant to be an olive branch, yet they felt hollow, weighted down by his inability to truly own the moment. "Thank you, Deborah," she said steadily and deliberately. There was neither warmth nor hostility in her tone. She would not allow him to pull her back into the smallness he had tried to impose. Her performance had spoken far louder than any rebuttal she could offer. Leonard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of the room's collective gaze, and gestured toward a waiter for another drink. "You've got quite a gift," he added, almost begrudgingly. Deborah nodded once, her gaze unwavering. "Everyone has a gift," she said deliberately. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." The room held its breath once more as the subtle sting of her response rippled through the air. It was not loud or aggressive, but it was enough. Leonard shifted in his seat. His usual air of dominance slipped further with each passing second. Gradually, the diners began to turn their attention back to their meals. The energy in the room had shifted entirely, from the quiet hum of privilege and pretense to something richer, a shared understanding, perhaps even respect, for the waitress who had reminded everyone of the power of authenticity. Leonard was not simply humiliated, he was exposed. No amount of charm could shield him from the truth. By now, everyone in the room saw Deborah for who she truly was. As she stepped away from the piano, the weight of the moment settled in her chest. Her colleagues greeted her with quiet smiles and subtle nods of encouragement as she returned to her station. Although she still had a job to finish, something about her posture had changed. Her head was held a little higher and her movements were more deliberate. Leonard's table quieted. His entourage, which had laughed so freely at her expense earlier, now avoided eye contact. Their conversation, once full of bravado, had evaporated, leaving only an awkward silence. The night continued, but Deborah felt lighter with every step. As she refilled glasses and cleared plates, a patron stopped her to offer kind words. "You're incredible," an older woman said softly. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving. Keep going." Another man added, "You've got something special, don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Deborah thanked them with quiet humility, her heart swelling with gratitude. These compliments were not just words. They were validations of everything she had worked for, everything she had dreamed of becoming. Leonard, however, was not as gracious. As Deborah approached his table to deliver the check, he looked up at her with an expression teetering between annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he said in a clipped tone. "No need to rub it in." Deborah paused, meeting his gaze directly. "It was never about proving anything to you," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I just wanted to play." Leonard offered no response, fidgeting with his drink as his once commanding presence was reduced to an awkward shuffle. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone at the table knew it. As Leonard scribbled his signature on the check, one of his companions, a younger man with a softer demeanor, looked at Deborah and said, "You were amazing, truly." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment she saw a flicker of humanity in a group she had written off as shallow. "Thank you," she replied with a small smile before walking away. The night ended with Leonard and his group leaving quietly, their usual grand exit replaced by a hasty retreat. Deborah watched them go, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness. She wasn't thinking about Leonard anymore. Her mind was already on the next step. The tips from that night had been unusually generous, enough to cover her rent and leave a little extra for the piano lessons she had been postponing. As she locked up and walked home, the crisp air filled her lungs, and Deborah felt something she had not felt in years: certainty. She was not just a waitress, and not merely a dreamer. She was an artist, and nothing, neither mocking words, financial struggles, nor fear, could take that away from her. That night, as Deborah sat on the worn bench in her small apartment, her fingers gliding over the keys of her old upright piano, the sound was not as crisp or rich as that of the grand piano at LaFontaine, but it did not matter. The music came from her heart, just as it always had. In that moment, something shifted within her. It was not just a moment of triumph, but a realization that her talent was not something she needed to hide or justify. It was hers, and it was enough. In the days that followed, the events at the restaurant became something of a local legend. Patrons who had witnessed her performance shared the tale, and word began to spread. A few days later, Deborah received a call from a man who had dined that night, a music producer visiting from Nashville. He wasn't offering fame or fortune, but a chance to record a demo, a step towards something she had only dared to dream of. Deborah agreed, not because she believed it would change her life overnight, but because it felt like a door opening, one she was not afraid to walk through. For years, she had let fear and doubt whisper lies into her mind, telling her she wasn't enough and that her dreams were too big. Now, she saw the truth. Resilience and authenticity were her greatest strengths. The incident with Leonard Grayson was not just a humiliating spectacle turned victory, it was a reminder of the power of integrity. Leonard, with all his wealth and bravado, had nothing that could diminish her. He represented every voice of doubt she had ever faced, and she had silenced him with nothing but the purity of her craft. To anyone watching her story, Deborah's message was clear: never let someone else define your self-worth. The world is full of Leonard Grayson types. People who project their insecurities onto others in order to feel powerful. But true power comes from staying rooted in who you are and letting your passions speak louder than their ridicule. As Deborah closed the piano lid and rested her hands on the faded wood, she smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time in her life, it felt as though it had truly begun. "What about you?" she seemed to ask silently. "What dream have you been holding back on because of fear or doubt? Don't wait for someone like Leonard to test you. Take your step forward now." Deborah's journey did not end with that single triumphant performance. In the weeks and months that followed, her act of defiance and the raw beauty of her performance ignited conversations about the value of authenticity and the power of art to heal and transform. Patrons who had experienced that night began to see that true greatness lies not in wealth or status, but in the strength to embrace one's passion despite the odds. Deborah's courage inspired others in her community, fellow workers, struggling artists, and even some of the restaurant's regular customers, to believe that they too could rise above their circumstances. In time, her once overlooked talent became a symbol of hope, and a reminder that every individual carries a light capable of dispelling the darkness of doubt and fear. As the buzz surrounding her performance grew, Deborah took her first steps toward realizing the dream that had long burned in her heart. She began taking evening piano lessons at a local community center and started performing at small gatherings and cafes. Each note she played became a declaration of self-worth and an affirmation that her identity as an artist, as a dreamer, was not defined by the hardships of her daily life. Her journey encouraged others in the service industry and beyond to explore and nurture their hidden talents, breaking free from the confines of what society expected of them. In the process, the atmosphere at LaFontaine itself began to change. Colleagues who once viewed Deborah as just another waitress started to see her in a new light, and even Leonard's table, which had once been filled with laughter at her expense, now buzzed with respectful whispers when her name was mentioned. The transformation rippled throughout the restaurant. Conversations shifted from shallow banter to discussions about passion, dreams, and the courage it takes to stand up against condescension. In that shared space, Deborah's victory became a beacon of what was possible when one refused to let fear dictate one's destiny. For Deborah, the grand piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a constant reminder of her inner strength and the promise that she would never allow anyone to define her worth. Each time her fingers danced across its keys, she reaffirmed that her dreams, no matter how big or seemingly out of reach, were valid and deserved to be pursued. And while Leonard's arrogance had once threatened to silence her, she had shown him, and the world, that authenticity and perseverance are far more powerful than any attempt to diminish another's light. In the quiet moments that followed her performance, as she sat in the solitude of her small apartment and let her fingers glide over the keys of her old upright piano, Deborah knew that her story was only beginning. The challenges she had faced, the doubts that had once whispered in the dark corners of her mind, and the financial struggles that had once threatened to hold her back, were now chapters in a narrative of triumph. Her music, now imbued with the pain, joy, and hard-won resilience of her past, promised a future where she could finally soar. Deborah's transformation is a testament to the idea that every setback carries within it the seed of a comeback. It is a reminder that each of us possesses a unique talent, a spark, that when nurtured can illuminate even the darkest moments of our lives. Her story invites every listener to ask themselves, what dream have I been holding back on? How long will I let fear dictate my choices? In her victory, we find the courage to pursue our own aspirations, no matter the obstacles. As the echoes of that magical night continue to reverberate through the halls of LaFontaine and the hearts of those who witnessed it, Deborah stands as a living testament to the power of resilience. She reminds us that true strength comes not from conforming to the expectations of others, but from daring to be unapologetically yourself. And in doing so, she offers a gentle yet powerful challenge, to look beyond the limitations imposed by doubt, and to step forward into the light of our own potential. In the symphony of life, Deborah's melody is a clarion call for us all. A call to embrace our passions, to reject the forces that try to silence us, and to transform our pain into something profoundly beautiful. Her journey teaches us that, no matter how many times we are pushed to the edge, we have the power to rise again, to redefine our destiny, and to let our true colors shine. And so, as you reflect on her story, remember that your voice matters, your dreams are worth fighting for, and sometimes the most extraordinary triumphs begin with a single, brave note. If Deborah's story has inspired you, subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph. Remember, your story could be next.